All right, so I'll start off this class like I did last one, apologizing for my voice. Not quite up to its usual place, but we'll do the best we can. In the last class, in the lecture notes, you'll see a slide that we posted announcing the times and the locations of the review sessions that the teaching fellows will have. So if you'd like to take advantage of those review sessions in preparation for next Wednesday's exam, please feel free to do so. And please remember as well that you will not need to turn in a concept sheet for next week, just as a little extra opportunity to prepare for the exam. Are there any questions about the exam that people like to ask now? Yes?
Describe the format.
Okay, describe the format. It'll be brief answers, a few definition type things like define this, that, or the other thing. But mainly it'll be brief essay type answers to questions. And in one of the previous lectures, I gave an example of an exam question from the last time I taught the class, and that's a good, and also the criteria that we did use to score that particular question. So that'll give you a pretty good idea about how we ask questions and the type of things we're looking for in the answers. Yeah, I don't want anybody to get fooled by the nature of the exam. So hopefully we've done a good job describing that. Another question? Okay, go ahead. The exam will be here, yep, and it'll take place during the regular class time. People will always have enough time during the regular class time to answer the questions. Right now it looks like there will be 6 questions that you'll have answered. Some of them will have different parts to them. In fact, each of them will have different parts to them, but it'll be comprised of 6 questions, and you'll get points for each question, and it'll add up to 100 points, 100 possible points. Okay, good. Let's get started. The last evening I received an email from a student in the class who said that I might be creating some misperceptions about farmers and farming in general. I was grateful to get that email because I'm always happy to hear from you folks about things that you think may be things I'm covering in class that may be biased, may be leave out important information, or there are things you'd like to see included that I haven't. Please let me know that, because I really appreciate that feedback. In some cases, there will be time during the class to repair the problem that you might identify, but at the very least, it's helpful for the next class I teach. So please pass along that kind of feedback. But I wanted to address that question in particular, which I think is really very important. If you look at farming in balance, it's sort of up and down sides. There's a lot to say on each side of the equation. And one thing we cannot do is to create a stereotype of what the typical farmer is like. Because a farmer can range from a person that has an acre or 2 of land and grows a lot of different crops to somebody that has thousands of acres and may not even own the farm him or herself, but just lease the land from a larger enterprise and have control over much more stuff and only raise one particular crop or one animal. And so within that wide array of farming practices, there are farmers who care deeply about the land. There are others who care less and are just in it for the profit. There are some who care deeply about the animals they raise. There are others who care less about them. There's caring, there's callousness, there's really all of this mixed into the picture. And we're talking in the last class and in this class about sustainability. And in the context of that particular issue, there are important concerns that have been raised about modern farming practices. So by definition, in the last class and this class, we're talking about some of the downsides of modern agriculture. When we talked in the Green Revolution, we talked more about the upsides of modern agriculture. And we're going to come back later in a subsequent class, and I'll have some guest lecturers come in, the folks particularly who run the Yale Sustainable Food Program. And these are individuals who are farmers. Yale has a farm that they run. There are people who interact with farmers who bring in food to the Yale dining halls. And these are a group of farmers who care very deeply about their farming practices and care deeply about the land and about the animals and things like that. So in that class, you'll get a more positive picture. So what I don't want to do is leave the impression that farming is inherently dangerous, inherently bad, or inherently callous, because it's not necessarily those things at all. There are those practices, and it's true that there are a lot of pressures on modern farmers to be, I mean, they have to survive in the marketplace. And those pressures make them compete with what other farmers are doing in the marketplace. And that means if their crops are yielding more because of things like pesticides and fertilizers and the like that we've talked about in class, or they're using genetically modified crops, it puts a lot of pressure on individual farmers to follow those kind of practices. Some farmers yield to all of them, some to part of them, some to none of them. It really depends on who the farmer is. So the picture is actually quite an interesting and complicated one with a lot of different things going on. And I alluded to this last time, but if you look at how the American farm has changed over the last 100 years, you see that the number of farms has gone way down. So as you can imagine, I'm sorry, I went too fast on that. The average size of the farm has gone way up. And so there are some farms that are many multiples of the average here, but the number of people that own and run small farms has gone way down. The average number of crops, as you see, has gone way down as well. And so this monoculture has created some negative consequences, but some upsides as well. So there are good and bad parts of everything. And then the number of people in the population, the percentage of the population that work on farms, has really changed dramatically. So there are up and down sides of this, and we'll talk about both in class. But again, I wanted to deal with that particular perception. All right, as we talk about food and what issues around food people care about, there are a number of them. And these terms have been used a lot in class, and they'll continue to get used. Each has definitions, some of which we talked about already. But it's interesting that different people care about different parts of these. And at the end of the class, I'll come back to how there may be some common ground that unites all of these particular interests. But today I'd like to talk just briefly about definitions of organic and sustainable and what they mean. The definition of organic is precise. It's driven by the U.S. Department of Agriculture that in response to what farmers were asking for was set a uniform standard for what it meant to be organic. And there are different parts of the whole food chain process that you see listed on the screen that have to be met if something is truly considered organic. And so it has to do with the seeds, it has to do with how the crops are grown, how the animals are raised, and how the food is processed. And if a farm meets all these criteria, then what the farm is producing can be considered organic. This is administered through something called the National Organic Program, which is run by the USDA, and the symbol that you see on the right is granted to crops that meet those criteria, and it covers those criteria that you see on the bottom of the page. So this has led to some real advances, because prior to establishing a national standard, people were using the word organic in many different ways, and consumers didn't really know what it meant. Well, now you know what it means. And so if you buy something organic in the United States and it has that USDA symbol, it means it's met those criteria on the previous slide. Sustainability is different from organic. Something can be raised sustainably but not be organic, and vice versa. So sustainable really has to do less with the crop itself or the animal itself than with the conditions under which they're raised. And so the UK Sustainable Development Commission has what I think is a nice definition. So safe, healthy, and nutritious food can meet the needs of less well-off people. So there's a social conscience part of it that's built into the definition. Provides a valuable livelihood for farmers, processors, and retailers whose employees enjoy a safe and hygienic working environment, whether in the UK or overseas. Now, there are different pieces to that. There's the livelihood for farmers, so that in order for food to be sustainable, the farmer has to be sustainable. But it also talks about employees in the food system respects biophysical and environmental limits in its production and processing while reducing energy consumption and improving the wider environment. It also respects the highest standards of animal health and welfare compatible with the production of affordable food for all sectors of society. So there's a lot built into that as well. Affordable food, animal welfare, environmental friendliness. And then finally, supports rural economies and the diversity of rural culture, in particular through an emphasis on local products that keep food miles to a minimum. The whole idea about rural economies and rural culture is very interesting. And as you can imagine, rural culture has changed a lot with the number of farms going way down, the number of people employed on farms. Rural communities have changed an awful lot. And the attractiveness of living in those communities and working in those communities changes over time depending on the economic conditions and whether farms are thriving or not. So a definition of sustainability can have a lot of different pieces to it, all affecting different parts of the food system. So let's talk about an example, and sustainable or not, modified or not, and what qualities food may have, depending on what you're paying attention to. And there was an article in New York Magazine in 2006 that I thought was quite interesting here. They gave examples of two different tomatoes. The one on the left is called the striped German tomato, raised in New Jersey. It has a relatively short shelf life unless it's refrigerated, but that harms the taste properties. And so it's usually eaten locally or shipped into Manhattan, let's say. The cost is high because you can't raise so many of them. The one on the right is a hybrid round red that's grown different parts of the country, but particularly in Florida, cost a lot less. Now, we've all had the tomato on the right. It's in a lot of different foods we eat. And you can see from the consistency in the middle there, you can almost taste what that tomato tastes like just by looking at the picture. And it's one of those things that has relatively little taste. You know, people are amazed when they grow tomatoes in their yard how wonderful they taste, or when they get locally grown things at a farmer's market compared to the kind of things that are mass-produced and shipped long distances. And if you look at these two tomatoes, the striped German is grown more sustainably than the other one. Heirloom seeds are used, so it's not crossbred to create some modified version of the original tomato. It is the original tomato. The seeds are planted in a greenhouse. They're then transplanted into the field. They're harvested and trucked to the local market without much stuff going on them. The hybrid red, which is bred not for taste necessarily, but for color and consistency, because it would be great if you could have a tomato that had all the right properties. But in this case, taste yields in the breeding process to color and long shelf life so they can be transported long distances. But here's what happens. Here are all the things that happen to that tomato by the time the seed goes in the ground and it gets to you. So I'll just let you read that. So that's a lot of stuff going on with that particular tomato. And one can come to your own, you can come to your own conclusions about whether overall this is good or bad, because the upside is that we can get tomatoes any time of the year in any part of the country. The cost is relatively low. The shelf life is long, which helps the supermarket, and there's not as much waste and spoilage. But the cost is all those things, and the impact all those things do to the environment, potentially to our health. So, you know, there's good, there's bad, as there is with any part of these sort of things. But it's interesting to look at the two tomatoes as an example. Now, one of the reasons that there's a market for this kind of thing is that it goes in so many foods. So Burger King needs slices of tomatoes that look good and uniform because they're open all year long in all parts of the country. Taco Bell is the same thing for the tomatoes that go on. So the fact that there's a market for these foods creates a market for those tomatoes. And that's how, and the only way to meet that need and meet that demand is create tomatoes with certain properties. And that's where you get the differences between an heirloom, locally grown variety and the mass-produced varieties from somewhere else. So that leads us to the discussion of genetically modified foods. We've talked about this a little bit before in the context of the Green Revolution, but there's a lot more to say about the issue. And as with anything else, there are going to be up and down sides. Now, in the past lecture, excuse me, especially pertaining to the Green Revolution, we talked about the genetic modification of foods, the great increases in yields, the development of foods with certain nutritional properties, like the golden rice and things, where there's clearly an upside of the genetic modification. Now, we're talking about genetic modification today in the context of sustainability. And so, do genetically modified foods lead to a more sustainable world or a less sustainable world? Certainly a more sustainable world if you can increase the amount of food available to the population, but there are concerns with it as well, and I'm going to talk about some of those today. This is a graphic from the U.S. Department of Agriculture showing the increase in the United States, or worldwide increase rather, of genetically modified foods going through 1999. Now, it's interesting where in the world these things are grown. So these are the top 10 countries that grow genetically modified food. I'm going to show you not the first number 1, but all the other 9. And these are the countries and the number of acres. And if you add up these acres for all 9 of these countries that make up most of the top 10, it's 137 million acres. Now, as you may guess, number 1 on the list is the United States, and here's the number of acres. So the U.S. is the clear leader. It has essentially half of the world's total of planted acres of genetically modified foods. And as I mentioned earlier in a class, there's a social history to this. In the U.S., people don't care very much about this. We don't have to label genetically modified foods. Most of us don't ask whether the foods we're eating are genetically modified, and the population doesn't care. In other parts of the world, people care a lot about this, particularly in Europe. So some people have estimated that 40 to 60% of all the foods we eat in the United States have genetically modified constituents in them. If you go to a place like Europe, it's much, much different, much, much lower number, because people in those countries care about it. Now, the people who've written about this, the people who are concerned about it, have said it's mainly because of the muscle of the big agribusiness companies that have stifled debate in the United States and have basically won over legislators so that they don't do anything to regulate against it. Whereas in the European countries, and this is true in general, business is a less powerful force in the political system, and people do care about it. Legislators have stepped in with regulation and things, and the situation is much different than it is in the U.S. This slide shows where the genetically modified foods are around the world and what has increased in recent years. So I'm not going to pause over this too much, but if you care to go back and look at it, you'll see what's happening around the world. So just a few facts about this: number of millions of acres of it, how many countries are involved, and then again, the U.S. is half the world's total of crops. So here's, when we talk about genetically modified foods, we talked about golden rice before, and let's talk about BT corn, because this is something that's closer to home. And BT corn is a very prominent and highly controversial genetically modified food. The BT corn has been, it was developed to resist this particular insect that devours the corn and poses a great threat to the corn farmer's existence. And so the fact that this borer feasts on the corn so much leaves a farmer with several possibilities. One is to apply pesticides, and now the alternative is to plant BT corn, which is corn that's been developed to resist the insect itself without having to put on an external agent. And it works like this. So here's a little graphic of the corn borer eating the corn. And then there's this particular bacillus that is listed here. That's where the BT comes from right there. I'm sorry it's not a little more clear, but I'll show you this in another slide. That gene, the particular gene from this, is inserted into the crop, and then the crop develops its own expression of that gene, and then that crop can be bred, and that gene persists in the crop, and when the corn borer eats that particular corn, it dies. And so the gene, again, from this bacillus, which is toxic to the corn borer, is inserted into the corn. The corn then expresses the gene, and the corn borers consume the toxin, their stomachs rupture, and they die. So this, as you can imagine, depending on the cost, has some real advantages to the farmer and potentially to the environment, because you're not spraying pesticides on to get rid of the corn borer. Now, there are environmental concerns about the impact of the genetically modified corn, but there are some upsides too without having to spray the pesticides. So you can see a farmer makes lots of judgment calls about how to approach this kind of issue. You know, what's the worst of the two evils, what's better for my utility in the market, et cetera. And here's an example of one of those judgment calls that has to be made. Here's a slide from the University of Illinois that shows corn crops side by side, where on the left they've tried to deal with traditional insecticides to get rid of the corn borer, and on the right they've used Bt corn, and you can see a clear difference in how the corn is thriving, and of course different environmental concerns with these two things. So here are a few facts about Bt corn. Licensed for use in 1996, so it hasn't been around all that long. It's now 35% of the U.S. corn crop and growing. The concerns about it are that it travels long distances in the ecosystem. So if that slide that I showed you before from the University of Illinois would be typical, the genetically modified corn is not, and its byproducts in the corn plant are not going to be confined to that particular field, because they'll be carried elsewhere, particularly through rainwater, flooding, and storms, into other places. And so to the extent that the genetically modified corn is having negative impacts, then it is not confined to the areas just where it's being grown. There's also concern that this kills more than the corn borer. Potential allergic reactions when people consume the food. That's a controversial and not very highly studied area. And then there are always concerns about unknown effects on human beings from consuming these genetically modified foods that we just haven't discovered yet. Not enough science has been done. So that's a big question mark at the moment. So here would be an example of how this concern about the spread of the genetically modified organisms might be a problem. So you have the Bt corn over here. Through streams and floods and rainwater, the corn itself will spread downstream, sometimes quite long distances. And then there's this particular insect here, the caddisfly, which is not the target of the Bt gene, because the farmers aren't concerned about this particular insect because it's not eating the corn, whereas the corn borer is. So it kills not only the thing it's intended to kill, but other things as well. This is a common food for fish and amphibians in these streams. And so you can see how the whole ecosystem can get affected by something like this. And so when one talks about the costs and the benefits of genetically modified foods, this is the sort of thing that has to be factored into the picture. Now, there's a large concern about genetically modified foods and their transfer and contamination to different parts of the environment. So here would be a hypothetical example. So here are wheat crops. And let's just say that this white line represents the property line between two farms. And one farmer A owns the property on the left and is growing wheat, and farmer B owns the property on the right and is growing wheat there. And let's say on the right it's an organic wheat, and on the left it's GMO wheat. The question is, does the farmer on the right suffer potential negative consequences from the fact that he's right next door to somebody using genetically modified wheat? And there have been lawsuits filed about this from farmers claiming contamination by nearby genetically modified crops. And so the concern here is that there's contamination from one farm to the next, or transfer of genetic material from one to the next, and that it can happen through a lot of things. Wind, water, birds, animals, and humans can transfer them. So, you know, a truck that is full of the harvested wheat from the left going down that road and some of it blows out and the wind's blowing toward the organic wheat, you potentially have issues. Birds will transfer things, etc. And then the question is the livelihood of the farmer on the right affected by the one on the left? And would his crop then, when it's crossbred that through the sort of natural process of the transfer of these things, not have an organic crop any longer because it doesn't meet the non-GMO criteria that's part of the organic set of criteria for being considered organic. So these become very interesting issues. And so, again, GMOs may be good or bad, but to the extent that they have negative consequences, this is one of the concerns that people have raised. There's a book by a man named Jeffrey Smith called Seeds of Deception. And you can see from the title of the book how he feels about genetically modified foods. This is the third time I've taught this class, and in the first class I had him come and speak to the class. And he's a very interesting, colorful, and passionate person on this topic. And he cares a lot about these sort of things. And the book is very interesting. And it's a combination of a review of the recent science on the issue, but also anecdotal things that are most interesting. So, for example, he would talk about cornfields or wheat fields where flocks of birds migrating from the north to the south would stop every year. Similar flocks with same number of birds and things, and feast on the fields. And then a farmer, and so then one farmer would plant genetically modified crops, the other one would keep the traditional crops. The birds would come and completely ignore or stay away from the genetically modified crops and continue to go to the traditional crops. What does that mean? Who knows? But there are all these anecdotal reports that are really very interesting in that, and those are contained in this book by Smith. Now, whether you take his message and consider it alarming or alarmist depends on your point of view. And if you think GMOs are a potentially bad thing and the concerns outweigh the benefits, his book is alarming. And there's a lot in there that would make you say, oh my God, I can't believe that's true. And then, but if you believe that the genetically modified foods are a good thing for the environment and for the economy and for farming in general, then you look at this and say,